So let's go through the Paris Agreement, what is in it and why it matters. And when I say we're going to go article by article, I mean, I'm not going to like go over intensely the whole thing. It's more for us to get general grasp of where the policy is and what we're talking about in COP right now. I want to mention the preamble because it's pretty important and it's done something that no other environmental document has done before, but it talks specifically about a just transition and protecting marginalized communities and human rights, when like most environmental text doesn't really do that. And this includes like migrants, children, gender considerations, people with disabilities, etc. It also talks about like how we need to protect our ecosystems, and then how we need to like keep up with our people. And so I just thought this was like an interesting centering that was really hard fought for by civil society, that like is important to recognize because that's something that countries agreed to center on. And so we need to remind them that that is part of this agreement too. So in some of these articles, I'm not going to go over, like Article 1 is very much like, here's the Paris Agreement, yay. But we're not, so I might skip articles if I don't think they have super relevant policy elements. But when we're thinking about Article 2, there are like 3 key parts to Article 2, which is the global goal, which we established, so keeping well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and then trying to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5. Adaptation is one of the goals, is to like make sure that we're helping people adapt and build resilience, and then finance. And basically how the Paris Agreement is framed is it kind of goes from these like really large concepts into like a little bit of the how as it goes through this. And one thing that's used throughout the Paris Agreement often is this kind of idea of like reflecting equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of national circumstances. You'll see that a lot. So like whether like the United States has a very different responsibility than like Fiji would, for example. And so that comes up in a lot of the conversations that we're having today. Moving on to Article 4. So this is kind of what like sets up the framework for how are we going to move greenhouse gases down. So thinking about like how do we peak global greenhouse gases as soon as possible? How are we going to preparing community NDCs, and the NDCs, which are those nationally determined contributions, need to show that they're actually progressing. It lays out that the NDCs need to be submitted every 5 years, and that should be informed by the global stocktake. It says that we should consider common timeframes. So common timeframes, just to define what that is, essentially, the NDCs, if you look across the board, have very different like when they start considering different emissions and like when it ends. For example, I think the US uses like 2005 emissions because that was right before the collapse. And so that was at our peak emissions rate. And so like that's our time frame that we use for that. And then we also are using like a 20 to 25, or sorry, in this case, it's a 10-year time frame for our NDC, because it said it's kind of a goal for 2030, whereas some other countries are using like 20 to 25-year time frames. So it's trying to figure out like how can we keep countries on kind of the same trajectory in order to be able to just like calculate things together, because if everybody's in a bunch of different places, it makes it hard. A party can decide to enhance an NDC at any time. And then also working on long-term low carbon development is encouraged. And so this is like really thinking about like how do these NDCs work? It's what Article 4 is about. Article 5 is about essentially saying that like we can have results-based payment for emission reducing activities. So like these are sort of saying like there are market abilities within the agreement, like supporting forests and sustainable development overall. And it sets up that market-based mechanism, which gets us to Article 6. So you probably hear about Article 6 a ton. And so here's kind of the components of Article 6, and I have 2 slides for it because it's being talked about a ton and has not been completed in like the how do we do this kind of conversation. So parties can use cooperative approaches, and there's this is an acronym that I just want to point out. So ITMO, or transfer mitigation outcomes. Those are the things that are like the little units basically that you can trade between countries. And so those are, when you hear countries talking about ITMO, this is what they're talking about. It's like, how can I pay your country to reduce your emissions? And then it counts towards my NDC. But we need to make sure that there's no double counting. So like it can't count towards your NDC if I'm counting it towards mine. And there has been some challenges with that, which is why it's been challenging to work through Article 6. Additionally, it's unclear how Kyoto fits in this, because under Kyoto, there have been these like credits, if you will, under the Clean Development Mechanism, and some countries would like that to transfer over into the Paris Agreement. And then basically, then we have like the mechanism is supported under the guidance of COP. So the parties have to really agree on what this all needs to be like, what this all needs to look like. How do we make sure that that double counting doesn't happen? And how do you know like when you're actually reducing for an NDC? And so that's really what some of that framework is about. Then continuing on Article 6. So additional things that it mentioned is that proceeds from activities can cover admin expenses and help developing countries. Specifically mentions meeting the cost of adaptation, which has also been an issue. It's just like, how do we incorporate like, if we have this market mechanism, how do you cover the admin costs? And then what does it look like to actually create a subset of funds for adaptation? So that's being talked about quite a bit. And the parties have to agree to all the rules and modalities for the mechanism. So at this point, there are some parties who are in the position of like, I'd rather just not have a mechanism if it's going to be a bad mechanism than like supporting a mechanism that actually could harm people and the planet. So there's been a lot of tension around Article 6 because it's really hard to define the rules around these market mechanisms. And that was what a substantial part of the subsidiary body conversations that happened in June were about. And then it recognizes the importance of non-market approaches, which is good, but definitely the markets are where like Article 6 is getting tripped up quite a bit. So Article 7 focuses a lot on adaptation. So like the global goal on adaptation, and basically, and this is something that like they've actually been talking about, because like it's much easier to say there's a global goal for mitigation, like we have to stay below on 1.5. But this has been a place where countries have struggled because there's not like this like targeted goal per se for like this many adaptation projects have to be implemented, because it just keeps going. And so the US State Department has actually asked for feedback about like, what is this goal in adaptation besides like helping localities and subnationals adapt, but like thinking about how does it actually work and how does a global community come behind it? And then trying to think about also like country considerations, making sure that like it's really focused around the people. And so that has been a conversation that's coming up quite a bit. There also through this has been national adaptation plans, or NAPs. And so countries have been developing those and releasing them to the UNFCCC to kind of like have conversations on what needs to happen around adaptation. And here is that. So like national adaptation plans, national assessments and monitoring and evaluation. These are the 3 core components of like what countries are supposed to like sort of put together and support. There's also a call for technical support with early warning systems and informed decision making. And then there has to be communication about these national adaptation plans. And all of this, like this adaptation goal is planning to be looked at in the global stocktake, which we'll talk about. A lot of things come back to this global stocktake, which is Article 14. So we'll get there eventually, but you'll see it referenced often. So this is kind of where everyone is kind of like at the global stocktake, we will see where we're at with all of this. But adaptation has been challenging for that reason. Article 8 is about loss and damage. To those who are interested in the loss and damage conversation, it's recognizing the importance of minimizing loss and damage. So there is the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is subject to the Conference of the Parties. Wherever you see COP, it's like the conference has to decide that. And so like the WIM is supposed to enhance understanding, action, and support on cooperative and facilitated basis with respect to loss and damage. And the support can look like early warning systems, looking at slow onset events, doing risk assessment and management, thinking about insurance, thinking about non-economic losses, etc. So the WIM is under the COP, but is trying to look at like, how do we work as a community, global community, on trying to address loss and damage. Just to bring up, like, so loss and damage has really been like put into the WIM, and the WIM reported during the subsidiary bodies, but a lot of times you won't see like loss and damage on formal agenda items, which has been an issue with developing nations, because they really want to see like, how are you going to help us deal with climate impacts that we couldn't adapt to because we didn't have time. And so this Article 8 just supports the Warsaw International Mechanism, but it also puts it in the Paris Agreement, which means countries have to deal with it, which is the important part. So Article 9 is about like thinking about the financial resources. And so developed countries, it's really a call for them to make sure that they're mobilizing climate finance, trying to balance between adaptation and mitigation, which hasn't been happening. It's been mostly mitigation work, and adaptation has been left far behind. And then again, they're going to use the global stocktake to get information related to climate finance. Article 10 is about technology transfer. So thinking about like, how are we developing adaptation and mitigation technologies, and how do you get those between countries and support each other? And once again, the global stocktake will account for technology development as well. Article 11 focuses on capacity building and what it means to like actually support mitigation actions, education, public awareness, communication, information, etc. And so really calls on developed nations to help support developing countries. And the reason this is so vague is because this was just the outline of what needed to be taken care of in the agreement. And then the rule book is really where it sets up how this is happening. And then Article 12 is really focused on ACE. So this education, ACE is action for climate empowerment. So there are 6 elements of ACE, which is education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. I feel like one is missing. Does an ACE folk want to chime in if you are on the call and say what I might be missing from there? I feel like something's not there.
I can, this is Jen Kretzer. So the one that's missing is coordinating networks, coordinating across networks.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. I will add that to the PowerPoint before I send it out. Thank you for that. Yeah, so that is basically setting up like countries have to work on action for climate empowerment together and sharing resources on that as well. Then we have Article 13, which is related to transparency. I'm bringing this up significantly too, because this was a huge issue during the subsidiary bodies, where they're trying to essentially figure out how do you track all this stuff and make sure that it's transparent and other countries can see it so they know that you're doing what you say you are doing. And it's been challenging because there's been some developing nations don't believe they have the actual capacity to be able to do some of the transparency work that some of the developed nations are asking for, meaning they don't have the staff or the necessarily the skills or capabilities that are being, or like the technology that's specifically asking for this one like little fact or figure. And then so it's been a huge conversation about like how do we actually make sure it's transparent, and like developed and developing nations can both do the transparency work. Also, it was to note, China had asked that the transparency conversations be closed this past subsidiary body, and so we'll kind of have to see where that goes. But that makes it hard for NGOs to kind of engage with this and see how can we like make sure that countries are reporting on the right things, is kind of what this is about. Article 14 is the global stocktake. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because this is like where a lot of stuff comes together. So the global stocktake is supposed to be like, we're going to look at all the stuff in the Paris Agreement, see what's working, see what's not working, kind of come back, maybe reestablish goals and do whatever needs to happen. So it's looking at mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation and support, which is like this capacity building, finance, ACE, etc. And like all together being like, is what we're doing as a global community working? So the first stocktake is in 2023, and it's supposed to take place every 5 years after 2023. And the outcome of each of these stocktakes is supposed to inform parties to update and enhance NDCs in line with what the stocktake is reporting in order for us to be able to reach the goals that are in the Paris Agreement, essentially. And so all those things that were referenced in the global, like in the previous articles about the global stocktake, that is all happening here. And in a couple of slides, I'll kind of tell you what's going on with the timeline because it's kind of funky right now. So the rest of the articles are more just like technical, saying who's in charge of like words and things, and like that it's all under the convention, etc. But Article 15 put together a expert-based group to promote compliance of the modalities of the COP. So like making sure that there's an external group that's kind of like watching what's happening. Article 19 allows for the subsidiary bodies or other arrangements to serve as the decision of COP. So like if all the parties agree that the subsidiary body for implementation can do XYZ thing, then they're allowed to go do that, but it has to be decision of the bodies. And then Article 28 is particularly important to the US because this is what protected us from getting out of the Paris Agreement when Donald Trump basically told them we were going to withdraw. And so that was added because of us basically at the very end. So I want to quickly, this is from WRI, and they have a pretty good website that's the Paris Rulebook, and it kind of goes over where are the different things. I would say though, it's been updated since Katowice, but not since Madrid. So it will stop at COP24. And I'll talk a little bit about COP24 COP25 in a moment. But this is kind of just the trajectory that you can see. So like there really was supposed to be the adoption of the Paris Rulebook in 2018 that did not really end up happening. But they got some of the base stuff. And then there was the Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2020. So 2020 was a really big year. But basically it was supposed to be when the newer updated NDCs, the long-term strategies, were going to take place. It's like really the first year of the Paris Agreement because Kyoto officially ends in 2020. And so it was supposed to be this like magical time of like, we have new NDCs and like all this stuff is happening. But the Paris Rulebook is still not complete and was not complete in 2020 because we ended in 2019 with our last summit. And so that's been just really an interesting challenge, and I'll kind of go into like where things are there. But this talks about, so we have global stocktake in 2023, which informs the NDCs in 2025, another global stocktake in 2028, which informs the NDCs in 2030, which is supposed to get us to this like long-term goal. And that's kind of what the path was sort of designed to do for the Paris Agreement. So I kind of want to go over where the rule book stands, because this is basically what's being negotiated now, and this is where it's creating a lot of tension. So the rule book was supposed to be finalized at COP25 before 2020, when the Paris Agreement was supposed to like really take effect. The reason some people called COP 2020 or COP 25 a failure was because of the fact that we did not finalize the rule books, and it was pushed into the following year under Rule 16. So Rule 16 under the convention basically says that any item on the agenda that has not been completed automatically goes on to the next session until otherwise decided by a COP. So like it was 2019, we hadn't completed the rule book, coronavirus hit, and then we lost a year in which we were supposed to be doing all this stuff. And so we're still talking about these elements that I kind of highlighted throughout the presentation of Article 6, reporting requirements for transparency, common timeframes, and you could argue loss and damage and adaptation because they just haven't been on the agenda. But these are ones that have been pushed to the next COP because of this rule, which is like interesting and weird. But that's like this framework that you're in. So that's why it's so important to know this, because it's just like all this stuff was supposed to happen and we are really behind. And I think that's part of the pressure to have this COP is because this was supposed to be like a last year was supposed to be a monumental year. And not only we are a year behind, but we don't even have the rules still set up, and climate change is getting worse. And so that's kind of where the rule book stands.